the best way I can sort of sum up parenting is it is really, really hard and it is really, really great. And for me, the good parts outweigh the hard parts, but it is so hard when you're on the fence to imagine that, because you can imagine the hard parts. You see, people struggling with having children and how hard it is. We see the TikToks, we see all of it, but you can't, even if you see, the love that your friend has for their child, I think it's really hard to imagine that for yourself until you go through it, which is why I think that we have to step out of making the right choice and really lean into desire. And then based on that desire, making commitment to yourself to take action that is in line with how you want to be a parent and how you can, take care of yourself and your family.
I'm Kelty McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. I feel like we need a jingle for today's episode, like something special to mark this episode, because we're doing what I really hope will become a recurring thing. With what frequency we shall see. But what I am calling it is Dear Former Fence Sitter, because I get so many great questions from you to my emails, to my DMs. I unfortunately do not always have time to answer them all. And I also have to say I am a big fan of the sort of classic advice column. Of course, used to be written in magazines, newspapers. Now we have it in the form of a podcast. I don't know if there's any other Cheryl Strayed fans who wrote the book Wild, but she was writing for, I think it's called Rumpus. I have to fact check that. But a column called Dear Sugar, which became a podcast with Steve Almond. I think he may have been the original Dear Sugar. I want to give credit where credit's due. In any case, this Dear Sugar, people wrote in with their sort of life dilemmas, problems, relationship issues, family dramas, really good, juicy content. I always love listening to this podcast. And so I was inspired to create my own kind of Dear Sugar here on the podcast called Dear Former Fence Sitter. And because I am someone who is child-free by choice, and despite the fact I always try and keep a very balanced, unbiased approach, I thought we need to sort of counterbalance that with someone who was a former fence sitter who had a child. And so I've asked Amanda E. White, who was previously on the podcast, that was episode 23, who is the founder of the Therapy for Women Center in the US. She is a therapist herself. She runs the Fence Sitter Substack. She has a fantastic podcast called Nuance Needed with one of her colleagues. You can check it out in the show notes of today's episode. And so I've asked Amanda on to answer some of your questions pertaining to the Kids Are Child-Free decision. So we have lots of good stuff for you today. Look forward to delving into it all. And let's get into today's episode. Hello, Amanda. Welcome to this very first experience we're having together, which is a special episode of the podcast called Dear Former Fence Sitter. Maybe, I know you've been on the podcast, and I just want to say, I would love for people, if they've not already become acquainted with you and your story, to go and listen to episode 23, which I know is the episode featuring you. But what can you tell us in terms of just a few things we might like to know before we delve into today's questions?
Yeah. So I'm a licensed therapist. I am also a mother of a 2-year-old. I sat on the fence for a very long time before deciding to have a child. And I really reckoned with that choice. I really thought about it. I was very frustrated that people weren't talking about this more, 5 years ago when I was like really wrestling with it. Yeah, I'm very passionate about. It feels like this way that I take care of myself by continuing to honor that part of myself that was ambivalent about having children, rather than just diving into sort of motherhood and pretending like I never had ambivalence. I try to honor that. And I also am the mom of an only child. So I still feel like I sit in between the worlds a little bit in terms of I kind of have one foot in child-free life a little bit with only having one. And then obviously the other foot is that I do have a child.
Yeah. Well, you do such a beautiful job, like you say, of honoring that past self. And I think it's important because sometimes when we, then have made a decision or a life change, we can look back on ourselves or our past choices with almost like, I don't know, sort of a disregard of like, oh, well, I just didn't have it figured out. But to recognize like being indecisive about this makes sense. It's a super complex decision. There's a lot of reasons, especially for those of us who are women, to give pause to this decision. And I know that the work that you do, everything you share, I'll give a shout out to your Substack, the Fence Sitter Substack, which we'll make sure to share in the show notes. You've shared both that it's kind of a way for you to also celebrate and capture your motherhood journey while helping people who are on the fence with this decision. So yeah, I'm really grateful for you, both for people who are on the fence and for myself as a wonderful resource and colleague. So I'm excited you're here. And I felt like it was important for these questions. I mean, we'll see with future former fence sitter conversations who those guests end up being. But I like that you're able to come at this from the perspective of having been on the fence, having chosen motherhood, and for myself, having been on the fence, having chosen the child-free path. So we can try and give perspectives from both sides.
Yes.
And yeah, as people will hear today, some of these questions are really like, what do you think? What was your experience? So I look forward to being able to maybe share a bit more personally than we sometimes do on the podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's just get into it. I'm going to read our very first question. So here we go. Dear former fence sitter, I'm a 36-year-old woman in the US and have been struggling with fence sitting for over a year now. I do not have children and am not sure whether or not I want them. I have friends and family who have said, I've always known I wanted to be a mother, or I've always known I wanted to be child-free. For me, I have never felt strongly about either of these things, and that's what's been the biggest challenge for me in this decision-making process. I feel like if I don't feel super strongly one way or the other, then I shouldn't commit to having a child or commit to not having one. Have you heard similar thought processes like mine in the past? What advice would you give me about making this important life decision? There are days when I can imagine myself raising a child, and other days I can't imagine changing my lifestyle or habits. For me, the biggest challenge is my health anxiety and fear of childbirth and pregnancy. It's the one thing that gets in my way of committing to having a child. I know there are other options like surrogacy and adoption, but both have cons. Surrogacy still involves medical procedures that I'm terrified about, and adoption means I wouldn't be biologically related to the child. Have you worked with others who have this intense fear? And if so, what kind of advice have you given them? Signed, stressed and confused. Okay, quite a few questions in there. I feel like, do we want to maybe address the first question about have you heard similar thought processes of mine of like, if I'm not here nor there, what should I do? How do I approach this? So what do you think about that?
I think that's probably the most common question I hear. And I think it is exacerbated by social media because social media is so black and white and extreme. And we are so polarized, just even in something as simple as like, do you want to have children or not? And it like teams form and it's this whole thing. And that was something I personally really struggled with as well, is the whole idea of if you even think you don't want to have kids, you should never do it. Especially, I think there is sometimes like morality that gets tied to it of this is such an important job. This is such a hard job. If you have a single doubt, you're doing your child like a disservice by having one. So I hear that all the time. And what I would say first is that it's way more common than you think. And I think that a lot of people are more ambivalent than they admit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they don't admit it though, so you don't think that they were ambivalent. Like, I think social media amplifies the people who say they're sure or talk about it, or people who are sure are more likely to talk about it compared to the people who aren't. And I think that creates a lot of pressure for people when they're trying to decide.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I just want to echo what you've shared that, I mean, I hear from this all the time. And I personally was in that position of feeling like, I guess I shouldn't decide either because I don't feel 100% confident and sure or fully want either. And it makes sense. This is such a layered, nuanced, big, complex decision. It makes sense that part of you would feel like, okay, I'm over here and I feel like I want this. And part of me wants the other life and I'm over here. And so what sort of advice would you give then, as she asks about making this big life decision? I mean, there's a lot we can say, but as maybe a first one or two steps, how would you approach that?
One of the first steps I would say is I'm a big believer as a therapist in parts work. And it's this idea that we all have different parts of ourselves. And each of these parts sort of has wisdom about what we're going through. And just because you don't feel 100% sure. I mean, I think you could also inquire, how decisive of a person are you? Some of us are more decisive than others. But I think that, I think trying to untangle and recognize that just because a part of you feels like you don't want to do it, or maybe a very strong part of you feels like you do want to do it, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong. What I always advise people is you have to kind of disentangle the true desire to have a child from the doubts, the fears, the logistical constraints, the barriers, any of those things, before you can really, my suggestion would be to start there, start untangling, because in the whole question, she talks about her fears and things like that. So I would start to try to separate those out.
Yeah, I agree. Sort of, I mean, and we can even make a list and just kind of write down, like, what are all those different parts of myself or different voices saying, telling me, what parts of me are enthusiastic, what's giving me pause, because then we can really start to address and work through and explore the different things that are at work. Like you say, disentangling is a good way of putting it, because it can feel like it's just, hopelessly complicated and there's no way of finding our way through.
Yeah.
Now, on this topic of fear of childbirth and health anxiety and pregnancy, this is a little bit of a teaser for an upcoming episode, because you've been kind enough to connect me with Gabrielle Solomon, who's going to be coming on to talk specifically about this. So we do have an upcoming episode, so we won't go too much in depth. But I'm just wondering if this is something that you have any advice around, this sort of intense fear around this, and how you might start approaching that.
Yeah. I mean, I always try to be clear that, you don't have to get over any fear that you have. You have a right to feel how you feel, and you don't have to just face it because you have it. And I think that is one thing that really frustrates me in the space is, especially I would say therapists who probably have children are more likely to be a little biased and say, like, well, you can't let, your fear of having a child hold you back. And I disagree. I think you can let fear do whatever you want it to do, because at the end of the day, you still have to make the choice about having children, and you get to decide whether you, face a fear, quote unquote, or not. But I think it is valuable to understand the fear and, again, separate it from the desire. So then you understand what is making that decision. And you're not then being led by these invisible forces, and you're actually aware of what's going on. I think it is hard because pregnancy is scary. Having a child is scary. Yeah. It's not a health neutral event. There are no guarantees for how it works out. So it does require facing that, surrendering control, allowing risk. If you do have a history, I think looking at phobias and fears is important. And that's why I'm excited for Gabby to come on the podcast, because she specializes in phobias and anxiety, health anxiety specifically. Yeah. But yeah, even so my recommendation would be, don't go to therapy even to be like, I need to, unlearn this or face this so I can have a child. Learn about this and get support around it, so then you can be confident in making the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such good advice. And while something like a fear of pregnancy or childbirth, of course, we can say that pertains to this very specific situation and decision, when you talk about things like, this lack of control and just how much in life there is uncertainty, and certainly that something we'll face no matter what we choose, I would probably say that some of those broader concerns or issues or challenges, I know some of which I face and have struggled through myself, those are always going to be worth addressing, ultimately, no matter what you choose.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only other thing I'd say is, what's so interesting is, now that I've been a parent for 2 years at this point, I think it would be so easy, if I wasn't doing this work, to sort of revisionist history my experience of being a fence sitter. And because my life has changed so much, and it's so clear how much I love my daughter and I love being a parent, I think it would be so easy to just be like, I was a little unsure, but of course I wanted this. And I think I would take it with a grain of salt the people who say, I've always wanted this, who are firm in their decision. Like, it is very easy once you've chosen to have a child and have one, or chosen to not have a child, to be like, I always knew I never wanted to have a child, or I always wanted to be a child, or not to be a child, to be a parent.
We all want to be kids. Yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating too, to just sort of watch my own experience and watch my own thoughts. Have you experienced anything similar, Kelty?
Yeah, I would say, although intellectually I don't forget how difficult it was being on the fence, I think it's sometimes, because I'm talking with people about it all the time, I would say in a way it keeps me in that space more.
Yeah.
But I think the emotional sort of like overtone of just how angst-ridden this experience of being on the fence is, it does dissipate once you've made a decision. And it is easy to feel like I was always destined to be here in this place. And I don't regard my decision that way. I think that any one thing in my life, whether I'd chosen to live in a different country, like, I'm an expat living here in Germany, or I'd met a different partner, or maybe some of the things that had happened to me in my life, positive or negative, like, I don't feel like this was inevitable. I do feel like I made an active choice. And I think it is, I agree with you. It's easy to feel like, oh yeah, this is just, it's always been my path. It was about me having to discover that or acknowledge it, or I always knew. And that's something that for people who've been longtime listeners, like, I will gently call my guests on, because they'll say, oh, well, I didn't really make a decision. I just knew I wanted to or didn't want to. But even if there was an innate sense of knowing, which I would agree with you, I don't think that's always necessarily been there for a lot of people. But people tend to overlook the challenges, the second guessing, the insecurity around, but am I sure? Is this really what I want? Is this really for me? That part tends to get omitted, I would say. Do you agree?
Oh, that's such a good point. Absolutely. I think that's a really great way to put it, because, and I think it goes into also, people feel this pressure that there is one definitive right choice. And that is a lot of pressure to have. And then when you feel like everyone else just knew, or there was a right choice for them, when parents say, I can't imagine not having my child, right? Or non-parents say, oh my God, I look around at my friends with kids and I can't believe I almost did that. And and you too, we both are very clear that, either choice is valid, either path is valid. And, we talked about this. I'm doing on my Substack, I had you come and we did a podcast interview on it. And we talked about regret, and how you can make a choice and feel like you wouldn't regret it, but it also doesn't mean it's 100% the better choice. Like, I think if I didn't have kids, I also may not have regretted it either.
Absolutely.
Because your brain also is trying to always justify and make sense of your choices and how they fit in your life. So if you're a parent, you're going to find reasons why you love being a parent. And if you're not a parent, I think you're going to find reasons why your life is great not being one.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And that's protective, and it's smart, right? For us to do that. I think we should actively be doing that, reinforcing and reminding ourselves why we've chosen the path we've chosen constantly, rather than constantly thinking, oh, well, what if, and maybe this is the wrong move and that other path would have been better. That's generally just going to lead to discontent. So,
yeah.
Okay, great answers. And thank you for the person stressed and confused. We wish you luck with that.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Dear former fence sitter, I'm 30 years old and have spent a few years living abroad in France and New Zealand. Sounds amazing. Where I was fortunate to experience true freedom and a carefree lifestyle. However, since moving back to the Netherlands 3 years ago, I found myself settling down quite quickly. For the past 2 years, I've been with my partner, who has 3 wonderful children, ages 13, 15, and 19. They are independent, but their way of life is quite different from what I'm used to and how I envision my own. I'm gradually finding ways to carve out space for myself again, but a large part of our time revolves around coordinating everyone's schedules. This often leaves me feeling lonely, even jealous, as I have to, quote, share my partner. It brings a deep ache in my chest, what I can only describe as heartache, mainly because I've never experienced marriage or raising a child myself, let alone my own. I often think about the question people frequently ask about my private life. My lifestyle doesn't fit the traditional mold of husje, boomsje, Biestje. That's my Dutch. Oh gosh. So just side note, this expression, huisje, boomtje, biestje, is a Dutch expression symbolizing leading a nice and quiet conventional family life. So, our kind of version, white picket fence.
Yep.
And when people ask, would you like to have children, whether intrusive or not, I tend to push the question away quickly because it feels painful and complicated. My partner had a vasectomy but is open to reversing it. However, given how much time has passed, the chances of success are uncertain. I feel pressure considering his position, understandably, since he's not getting any younger. But at the same time, the stress of this decision is overwhelming. I wish I could approach it with more ease, as I still feel like I have time. I'm struggling to find an active way to reflect on this major life decision because most of the time, I feel swept up in the emotions of the household. At the same time, I'm tired of living in this space of uncertainty. Simone in the Netherlands. Okay, what do you have to say for Simone? I feel this situation for her. I don't know how you feel reading this or hearing this.
I feel it too. Why don't you go first, Kelty? Because I'm still processing it for a second.
Well, first of all, I think recognizing and just honoring yourself, Simone, for the fact that, as you say, this has been a huge life change. I mean, you're 30 years old, which we can say is relatively young.
Yeah.
You were living abroad. You had all of these freedoms, all of this independence, and now you're with a partner who has made, to date, relatively different life choices, we'll say, at least as far as having children. These kids, although they have their independence, there's certainly a presence in your life. There's 3 of them. They're teenagers. I'm sure there's, a lot to contend with there. And I think it's hard when you become a step parent because you haven't, yes, you can say you've opted in by being partnered with someone who has kids, but you didn't jointly choose this life of having kids. These are not your children, however close that relationship may be or not be. I speak with quite a few step parents who grapple with it, whether they're a big everyday presence in these kids' lives or whether they don't really know their stepkids much at all. And so I think recognizing that in itself, regardless of how you're feeling about the kids or child-free choice, is wow, your life has done a 180 and what sounds like there's not a clear timeline here, but 3 years ago. So in a relatively short period of time, 3 years is not that long. I would say, so there's a few different ways we can approach this, and we can talk about, potential conversations with your partner and how that looks. But one of the things that seems to be kind of an overarching theme is just the fact how all-consuming this all is. And to even think about what you, Simone, want for yourself, I would say does and will require you to be really intentional about carving out some time to explore this question of, I know it's hard to think about having kids outside of this circumstance, right? You're with your partner, they have 3 kids, but for you in and of yourself to try and connect with this desire or lack of desire to have children. And of course, your circumstances are ultimately, they will have an influence on maybe how much you want or don't want this. But if you could kind of think of yourself in and of yourself with this decision, even to ask under what circumstances might I ideally like to have a child or children, and vice versa to be child-free. So trying to think about what your own desires are and whether that's about going away for a few days on your own, whether that's about committing to doing therapy or coaching, being part of some sort of group container or one-on-one so that you have this time in your calendar to really sit down, converse, reflect, what have you, I think is really important. And I'm kind of copping out now. I'm going to turn it over to you a little bit, but I think getting clear in your own mind what your sort of ideal scenario might be, what you'd be willing to perhaps have flexibility or compromise on. You might say, I'd actually really like to have a few children, but perhaps my husband, I would talk to my husband or my partner about having a child together if there's an openness there, or maybe having a different kind of involvement in your role as stepmom and looking at that. But I think, as much as I think reflecting on the relationship with stepkids, that can maybe give us certain intel and information about our own decision, I think it's hard because at the end of the day, those aren't your own children. And you've also come into their life relatively recently. So
I wouldn't I wouldn't use your relationship with them necessarily as a barometer for how much you will enjoy or not enjoy being a parent.
Well said. Yeah.
I think one thing that really stood out to me is her talking about the ache and the loneliness. And I would be really interested in digging into that more, whether that ache and loneliness is for a child and is for a family, whether that is because she feels left out or more disconnected from her partner because he has this, other relationship with his kids and potentially still has a relationship, not a romantic one necessarily, but with the stepmom with his kid's mother. And I think that would be really important to separate, just to make sure that, I think sometimes people do think about having children as this thing that will help fill an ache sort of in our soul. And I think that sometimes that is the case for people, but I think that having a child is a lifelong investment also. And I think it would be helpful to understand, like you were saying, what are you yearning for? Is there something you want more out of the relationship with the stepkids? How will it feel? Because if you have a child now, right, like given how old those kids are, they are older. Like I think it sounds like if you don't have children, there is a window where you guys could go back to maybe traveling more or living more of an idealized child-free life for you. And it will sort of start over in terms of your freedom, if you have a child. So yeah, I really think your question, Kelty, of what are the ideal circumstances you would want to have a child? What are the ideal circumstances, right? If you weren't with this person and you didn't have stepkids.
Yeah, good question.
Was having a child something you really thought about and considered? Or is it only because the circumstances of your life have changed that it feels like, well, I'm already sort of tied down more anyway, I may as well have a child, which isn't even a bad reason to have one. Like you can feel like my life has changed and it fits. Like I've thought about that as a mom of an only child. I've thought like, oh, well, it would be easy to just have another child because I'm already going through this right now.
Yeah.
So I wish that was talked about, more as something I think people do consider. But also I think separating it so that again, why you're making that choice. And it's not just these subconscious, hidden factors or emotions that are driving the show.
All right, I have a very important invitation to make, and that is to join us for one of our upcoming Kids or Child-Free workshops. If you have not attended one of these 2-hour workshops and you are unsure whether you should have kids or stay child-free, this is the next thing on your to-do list to getting clear on the right choice for you. Head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to our workshop page in the show notes and get all the details on this 2-hour live online workshop that's going to help you get more clarity and direction in terms of whether a future with kids or a future without them is the right path for you. Tickets are only $45 and we have these workshops every month or two, so you should be able to find a date and time that works for you. If you can't join the upcoming date, make sure you sign up for emails so that you can get notified when the next date is announced. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I to sort of piggyback on what you shared about these the kind of ache that she feels within her, to really ask and be curious, to go back to our previous question about different parts of ourself. Like, what is that part of yourself trying to say? What does it need? What's it yearning for? What's really underneath of this? And this episode that we're recording now will be airing after a conversation I'll have with my friend Carly Church, who her situation is certainly different, but there's some similarities in the sense that she went from being single to partnered with a man with 2 children to now having a son they've had together.
Yeah.
And I did pose some of these questions I've had from people around, feeling maybe left out, feeling like there's this loss in not having that same experience. And what she said, at least from where she stands, having been in that stepmom role, is that more than anything, this is a conversation that needs to be happening with your partner. This doesn't have to do with, and even hypotheticals around, stepkids who are maybe potentially really difficult, or there's like a tough relationship there. That's not to say all of this needs to be discussed immediately, but if there's something or a need that's going unmet, it's not to imply that it's your partner's responsibility to fulfill that, but they may not even be aware of what's going on and how much this dynamic is causing you heartache, if you will. And there might be some simple, small things that can be done to either include you more, or conversely, maybe you don't want to be included in so many of these things and you feel like you've sort of had this responsibility heaped onto you where it doesn't feel like it's your role. So I would also be curious about that and just how much openness you've had, Simone, in your partnership with your partner.
Yeah. And I would say one more thing I just want to acknowledge, I think it is really hard to make this decision when you don't know, right, whether it will be possible to have children.
Absolutely.
With the, vasectomy she was talking about, I think that's something a lot of individuals struggle with, when they don't know their own fertility, or they know it'll be challenging to get pregnant because it is a bigger hurdle than just someone who can just try easily. So I want to acknowledge that too, that I think that is a factor that makes this decision more difficult, because there's a part of you sometimes that doesn't want to admit sometimes that you want a child if you know it may not happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And so would you say, like, do you think in that case it makes sense to, in her imagination, run with the assumption it is possible, or like to consider that factor later? Like, I realize at some point if she wants to have a child, it needs to be brought into the equation, but how would you consider thinking about or handling that if you were in her shoes?
I would treat it like anything else. We can't really protect ourselves from heartbreak by worrying about it and tempering our expectations. So I would, as she's trying to make the decision, I think the only way to make it is to think that you can have a child in trying to decide if you want one.
Yeah. And also at a certain point, I think to get information, right? I hear this from a lot of people. I'm not really sure about my fertility.
Yes.
And I mean, we only ultimately know when a baby is conceived and, carried to birth. However, there is sometimes information we can get. I want to say, and I don't want to speak out of turn, this may be inaccurate, but I do have a close friend whose husband had 2 children from a previous relationship. He had her vasectomy reversal. They do have a child together. And I understand it to be about 50% of, and maybe there's a reproductive health specialist thinking, oh, that's wrong, so please reach out. But just, you may not, I could be wrong. You may not even have that information, Simone. And so especially if you're tending that way, just to sort of get a little bit more well-versed in like what you might be looking at here could be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, another question. All right. I'm already like, we're going to have questions. First of all, for everyone who shared questions, thank you so much. And we will be having future episodes if your question doesn't get answered today, but I think we have time at least for 2 or 3 more. So let's see how we go. All right. This one's coming from Austria. And can I just say how cool it is having letters from people in all different parts of the world? I love this. Okay, this one's about friendship. And it's I know this is going to be a tender one for a lot of people. So, dear former fence sitter, I am a 36-year-old living in Austria who is on the fence but leaning more towards a child-free life. I'm currently in a situation where I almost only have friends who are already moms or are pregnant or who want to become moms. I feel very triggered by the fact that my friendships are changing right now, especially with those who are new moms. What I wanted to ask is this: do you have friendships that ended due to these 2 different life decisions? I still have the feeling that I need, as a child-free friend, to always be more insightful, more patient, and more supportive toward friends with kids. Even if I wish for the same amount of attention for my life and circumstances, despite not getting the same in return. I have one friend who is currently in her mom bubble, not always positive, and also because of the mental load, and I do not get the same attention from her as I give to her, even though my life is turbulent as well right now, which she doesn't know because she's not asking. I also feel the urge to keep these friendships alive, even if I can't feel the same vibe as before. I can't be so evil as to end the friendship just because my friend has a kid now and can't keep the friendship alive anymore as before. It would be so nice to know if you've experienced the same or similar experiences and how they were handled or how they ended up. And that one's from Christina. You first. I'm curious to hear about friendships from the mom perspective. Like, I have quite a few things I want to say here, but I want to hear from you first.
I mean, I haven't had any that have. It's hard because I've had a couple end. One of my friends who's child-free, I wouldn't say it ended, but we're not really friendly and close anymore. She also moved, I moved. So I think there are other circumstances that impact that. And I think there are certain, I think it's hard because I think there are certain child-free people who are kind of like, I know you're going to be a parent and you're going to not be the same, and I'm going to protect myself by pulling myself away. I think there are also parents who do that, who are like, you're not going to understand anymore, so I'm going to pull myself away. I was most scared about my friendships changing when I was deciding whether to have a child. So I am like insanely intentional about making sure that I keep the friends that are important to me. And obviously, I'm not in exactly the same way as probably available as I used to be, of course. One of my best friends doesn't have children yet. And one thing, she's my podcast host on Nuance Needed. And one thing she said recently, because we were talking about our friendship, and she said that what she looks for in parents is that they match the energy relative to what is available in their life. And I thought that was such a great way of putting it, of like, it's not going to be 50-50, at least for a bit, when your friend has a child. But if they only have 20% to give, are they giving a percentage still to you?
Yeah.
Are they still showing up in the best way that they have available? And it may be a lot less. And sometimes I think that, one thing with Sam and I is we live about an hour away from each other. She often does come to me because she knows that I have less time than her. And the choice is she comes to me more and we see each other more, or we split it more evenly and we see each other a bit less. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean she 100% comes to me, but there is more flexibility there. I think it gets more complicated when you are, I'm speaking of this perspective. I think it's easier for me as a parent because most of my friends do have kids. So I would imagine it's much more difficult when you are one of the only ones that doesn't have children and you're giving this more, but you're giving it in every single relationship that you have in your life, compared to, for me, it's not that hard because I only have a couple people. I have friends who have more kids than me, and I give them more grace in recognizing that they're going to be less available than I am. And that is sort of something that I've just surrendered to. But I also wish people would remember to, like, the first few, and I didn't understand this fully, in anyone's defense until I had a child. But the first few years of parenting specifically are the most intense. If your friend has back-to-back kids, then that extends that period of time a long time. So I think that one thing that I think about with my friends who have multiple kids is I believe that we will get back there more potentially.
Yeah.
Once they're out of this really intense phase. I also try to be more vocal about if I have an extenuating circumstance where I do really need just like a phone call with my friend, even if I know that they're not super available to have dinner with me or go do something, are there still things that they are able to do? Can I have a conversation with them about, okay, what actually does work for your schedule where we can connect a little bit? But I think it's tough. And I do think in general, I'm a big proponent of we need different friends for different reasons.
Yeah.
And I think if you're someone without children, you are going to need some child-free friends.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll answer the kind of the overarching question, which is, has this happened to you? I personally don't think I've had friendships end because of someone having kids, not me, because I'm the person who's child-free. I say I think because, bearing in mind, I've been in Germany about 7 years now. I have a lot of friends back in Canada. I also lived in Australia for a time. So a lot of my friendships, even with close friends, I'm not necessarily in frequent contact with them. And so it's kind of hard to gauge, like, is it just a season where we're not as connected because we don't live in close proximity, or because they're busy with their families and I'm gallivanting around Europe, or, whatever is going on. I would say something that I look at more than, does my friend have a child or children or not? Are they child-free? I think we need to bear in mind that sometimes what happens when people have kids is it can show us that we may not necessarily have as many of the same values or shared interests or energy, whatever, that we have had in the past. And I totally agree with you. Like, so everything that I hear is that those first few years are just super intense. And I would regard it, I know it can feel like a really long, difficult time if you're the person without kids, but to see it as a season in the relationship. And through that season, there may be a total change or dissolution of the friendship. And that may not be like a formal conversation where like we're breaking up, but you just may realize that you don't really spend time together anymore. But it could be that through that time, there are periods of time where you're closer. Let's say if you get the opportunity to like go away for a couple of days or you have a seldom visit, you might realize that that connection's still really close. It's just not as frequent. And then sometimes it could be, you know, a number of years where you don't have as much connection with that person, but that doesn't necessarily need to be an indicator for your relationship in its entirety. And I will share a resource in the show notes of today. I recorded a conversation for an event with one of my best friends who is a mom to one and a stepmom about a year ago called Between Friends. And we had a dialogue for about an hour just about sort of from where we stand, like what our perspectives have been for people with or without kids. And so it may be insightful to just, if somebody wants to delve into that a little bit more, there could be some things to explore there. When I talk about that sort of values piece and those similarities, what I find is that there are certain women I know who motherhood and parenthood has become and is all-consuming to a degree for which it may not be for others. And I want to bear in mind that also probably has to do with their relationship dynamic, the needs of their child, et cetera. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but my friends who have been able to or really intentionally focused on their own identity outside their child or children, they're a busy business owner, professional, they've got different hobbies. They may also just be able to, for whatever reasons, have more flexibility with their kids to say like, yeah, we'll totally go for a meal together or come after when they go down and we'll order pizza. Some parents I think it's just too much for them to manage that. Whereas I think having some flexibility that those times together may look a bit different, but it doesn't mean they don't need to exist at all. And I know this is a fine line for people who are child-free to sometimes walk of like feeling like we always have to be those ones to step up. But like, I think we also need to have empathy. I think there's sometimes this, we talk about that lack of nuance in the online space, right? Like, oh, just because you're the person without kids or single doesn't mean you're there for everyone and all their needs. Fully agree. Yes. And also, how big of a deal is it for me to say, I'll come to your house and we'll do takeout versus I want to go meet at this like shishi downtown club and why can't you get a babysitter and how come you don't want to hang out? Like having... If it's not that hard for you to go out of your way, and a lot of times it's not, then why not make that a little bit easier? So
I think too, as a parent, one thing that I think people who don't have children underestimate and don't think about is a big barrier for me with my friends who are child-free sometimes is that I am like embarrassed by like my child is going to act up, my child is going to throw a tantrum, my child's going to make noise, my house is a mess, right? And I think that barrier is hard sometimes. And it gets harder if you have a friend who, and again, like you just said, I'm not saying like be a martyr if you don't have children, but I think the barrier gets harder sometimes if someone is really insistent on wanting to keep the relationship exactly the same, go out, do certain things, because when you have less time, when you have that less capacity, what you need to find with a friendship is just those small moments. And I know that's something when I didn't have children that really helped with my friends is, I would be like, I don't care if your kids are there. I'm happy to hang out with your kids and be interrupted every 10 seconds. I just want to be with you. And that helped a lot. And now as a parent, I notice that. And what I will say to friends is, like if my husband is going away for a weekend or something and I have a friend that wants to hang out, I'll be like, look, I'm going to be with my child all weekend. I'm not saying it's going to be like fun the whole time, but if you want to hang out for a few hours at my house while she naps, or you want to meet us on a playground, like you can come. I just can't promise, right? Like good behavior essentially. And I can't promise that it will be the same as if my child isn't there. And that's been something that's helped me. And then it gives someone sort of choice.
Yeah.
And it's like a bid for connection, but someone it can still not work for them and they cannot be interested.
Yeah. And that may feel less than ideal or not something you want. And that's also okay too. And I would agree that having those other kinds of friendships, whether it's parents who are at a different stage with their kids, the kids are a bit older, or maybe they're, expecting, but they haven't had a child yet. Certainly looking to expand and connect with other child-free people, I do think is important. Even so, yes, partly in terms of maybe their life perspective and values could be different than some of your parent friends, but just from a practicality standpoint, like Chris and I, for example, we're very spontaneous often. Hey, let's grab a beer in 45 minutes. And so we need people who can meet us where we're at with that.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to say, and again, there's so much we could say, and I'm thinking we probably need to do at least a dedicated episode or two about friendship, because this is something we haven't delved into, and it comes up with a lot of people, especially those who have chosen or are leaning towards the child-free choice. When I hear this sort of language around like they don't even ask me about themselves, they have no idea what's going on with my life, I first of all want to honor, like, I'm sorry, it sounds like things are difficult, and I think we should recognize that there are different kinds of difficulties. It's not just having a child, and like we as child-free people also have our stresses, our challenges, our ups and downs.
Everything's relative.
Absolutely. I also think we want to be a little bit careful about, it kind of reminds me of, if for any of you who are in partnerships, it's like if you've had a bad day and your partner doesn't ask you, and then you're like, well, you didn't even ask me what's going on, and you have no idea how hard things have been. It's a little bit, I don't want to say passive aggressive. I'm not sure that's quite the right word I'm looking for, but if there's things happening in your life that you want to express to your friend, I can understand feeling upset if they're not asking you how you are, what's going on. And I would love for you to speak from the mom perspective of why that may not be, but then to feel like, I almost wonder if it becomes kind of a withholding, or like, well, they have no idea, they're not interested. And I say this because I've done this. This is not me trying to harp on the person who's written this letter to say like, you're in the wrong here. I've been that person where I'm like, I don't need to hear myself talking just to share things that this person doesn't seem interested in, because I know what's going on in my life. But they may also appreciate if you volunteer some of that and say, hey, you know, I know you've got a lot going on, but things have been tough recently. Like, I'm not sure if you'd be, you know, can we steal 15 minutes after the kids go down to be able to talk? Or would you, do you have the capacity for me to share this? And they may not, but don't just assume they don't care just because they didn't ask. Those are two different things. Well, what's your standpoint from a mom perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a theme that I struggle with online. Like, I'm sure you saw that article that came out fairly recently about, I think it was in The Cut, of someone saying, you know, my friends all had kids and I have no, you know, I'm a child-free person and I am very upset about it, and I, you know, the relationship's uneven and stuff. And I think that is one thing that I struggle with a lot. It's why I have a podcast called Nuance Needed, and I'm obsessed with nuance, is I worry sometimes in online spaces, we are breaking ourselves up into like children or no children, right? And it's like whether you have children or not versus parents. And it's like, no, this is like the system that is an issue. It is not us versus them. The issue that we could actually both agree on is that like there isn't, not to get political, you can cut this out if you want, but
no, we can talk about it all.
Like, right, the problem actually for both of those people is the system that doesn't support like working parents or parents having, you know, support, affordable healthcare, child leave, a support system. That's what we're missing. That's what's causing parents to be drowning so much that they can't hold a single thing. Having a child, a lot of times I didn't realize, is it feels like walking a very narrow tightrope, especially if you work, where if one thing sort of goes awry, your child gets sick, it feels like everything falls apart. And I think some people naturally curl up, make their lives smaller in effort to try to balance that tightrope a little bit more, and some people don't. But yeah, I would try to like zoom out and be like, I think it's less about your friend not caring about you, and I think it's more your frustration is actually her frustration as well, that the system is not designed well enough to support, you know, parents and mothers. And this is not how we were meant to raise children, especially, you know, I live in America, so that's what I'm speaking about.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you to Christina for that question. Again, that Between Friends episode will also link to. And it's so great being able to have this conversation from both perspectives, because I think that's so often what's missing here, right? Like we make assumptions about what the other person's thinking, what their reality is, et cetera. So, okay, I think we have time for one more question. I want to say let's make it a good one, but they're all so good. So, and for those, again, we had so many questions. We're not going to get to them all today, but we will do another episode very soon.
I love chatting with you, Kelsey.
Oh, let's see. Okay, so this question is not Dear Former Fence Sitter. It's specifically Dear Amanda. I felt a little bit hurt. But I'll be okay. I've mostly gotten over it. It says, Amanda, I find your little drops of wisdom in your Substacks to be very helpful. A while ago, you posted about having coffee with your former self and said this, quote, so did we make the right choice? Yes, I said softly, not because it's easy or because every moment is magical, but because we thought it through. We considered the logistics, the changes we needed to make, the reality rather than the fantasy. We knew it would be hard, and it is, but we do not regret it for one moment, end quote. And then our letter writer goes on to say, I think many people make the decision based on the fantasy and not the reality. It's an easy enough decision when you think about the most romantic parts of being a parent. It's all the other stuff that leaves you sitting on the fence. I was hoping you could elaborate on what you meant by saying this. What did you feel was beneficial for you in terms of preparing yourself for parenthood? Was there a specific moment where you realized, I can do this? Question mark. Yours from the fence, Laura.
Well, thank you, Laura, for this question. It's so kind when people say your words back to you.
Totally. You're like, wow, people are listening and reading. And
yeah. Well, I think one of the, I prepared a lot in terms of I thought about the decision. I really made sure that I was in a place in my life. I moved to be close to my family. That was a big reason that pushed me to have children, was I wanted to be close to my family and I wanted them to experience being grandparents. I wanted to see my parents be grandparents. So that was a big change that I did to be able to make that happen. I think one of the biggest things also that I recommend is that I think people, in regard to what you're saying, Laura, about a fantasy, I think people a lot of times think that having a child will fix something inside of them or make their relationship better or make their life better. And I would say a better way to understand it is it will amplify whatever is currently going on in your life and your relationships. The good parts of your life and your relationship, I think, will be amplified. I think there will be more joy. You will potentially feel more connection and love for your partner. But the fights that you have with your partner will also be amplified. The things you already disagree about, there will be more evidence about it. The things that bother you about them will be amplified more. And I think that is the best way I can sort of sum up parenting is it is really, really hard and it is really, really great. And for me, the good parts outweigh the hard parts, but it is so hard when you're on the fence to imagine that because you can imagine the hard parts. You see, people struggling with having children and how hard it is. We see the TikToks, we see all of it, but you can't, even if you see, the love that your friend has for their child, I think it's really hard to imagine that for yourself until you go through it, which is why I think that we have to step out of making the right choice and really lean into desire. And then based on that desire, making commitment to yourself to take action that is in line with how you want to be a parent and how you can, take care of yourself and your family. So for me, it really came down to I had a moment of realizing that even though I had 100 cons, and I literally said to myself and my husband, like, logically, it makes no sense to have a child. Yeah. Like, it is harder. My life will objectively be harder. It will be more dramatic. There will be all these things, but I don't know why, but I just want to have a child. And once we agreed about that, then we moved into, okay, what are some of the things we could do to maybe make this a bit easier? How can we save money to have a cushion to be able to get the support? How can we, we moved near my family. We had certain business goals so that we could set things up so I could be a little more flexible with things. Not everyone has that luxury either. We went to couples therapy. Like, there are things that you can do to prepare. I had a really hard pregnancy and I knew that breastfeeding would have been a terrible idea for my mental health. So I didn't breastfeed at all. So I think sometimes we do forget that there are lots of little choices in the decision once we have a child, and there are things that we do have some control over. but it is still ultimately a risk.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's asked questions. I really enjoyed this. I have to ask, I meant to ask at the beginning, what's your favorite like advice column? Were you a Dear Sugar listener like me?
I was a Dear Sugar listener.
So good, right?
I loved Dear Sugar.
Was I channeling like a little Cheryl Strait and asking those beautiful questions?
I think you were, definitely.
I try my best.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so Amanda, you've mentioned your podcast, the Substack. Do you want to maybe just tell us again where people can find you, how they can listen to more of your sage wisdom? And of course, also about the therapy practice, because there might be some people looking for support there.
Absolutely. So if you're in the United States, I have a therapy practice called Therapy for Women Center. We are based in the Philly area, but we have therapists online in 42 states. My podcast is called Nuance Needed. We explore everything with nuance, essentially, and break down everything we see online that we think is lacking nuance. And we really are invested in teaching people and modeling between my co-host and I what having nuanced conversations look like and how to challenge each other. And then, my Substack is called Fence Sitter, where I write about, my choice to have children and being on the other side of the fence and answer questions similar to the ones you all written.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. I always enjoy us connecting, and thank you everyone for listening. All right, before I say a final farewell, I just want to let you know that I have a bunch of free resources over at kidsorchildfree.com that you can download to check out. We've got a Kids or Child Free book guide with a whole bunch of fiction and nonfiction books to help you navigate your kids or child free decision with different perspectives, different stories that are hopefully going to help you shed some light on whether to have kids or stay child free. We also have a response guide, which is perfect for those of you who are grappling with nosy questions, people asking you like, so when are you going to have kids? Or what do you mean you don't want kids? I've got different scripts you can follow in terms of how to answer those questions. I also even have a little secret podcast episode, a solo episode that I recorded after a difficult conversation with a friend, really about how this kids or child-free decision, this whole conversation of should I have kids or not, can be very emotional and triggering oftentimes. So if you want to check out those and a bunch of others free resources that I have, head over to kidsorchildfree.com. I will include the link in the show notes for today's episode, and you can start downloading some of those resources to check out to help you with your decision.